The properties of fractions. Now, the properties of fractions are no different from the rules of fractions that you might have learned in elementary school, how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. But the properties are expressed algebraically using variables. So, for example, the addition property states that if you have the fraction a over c plus the fraction b over c, then the sum is just the sum of the numerators a and b over the common denominator c. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Let's add 3/7 to 2/7. Now, does this expression match the form of this expression? Yes, we have a numerator over 7 plus another numerator over the same denominator 7. So 3 is our A, 2 is our B, and 7 is represented by C. So all we have to do is take the sum of the numerators, 3 plus 2, and we put it over 7, and that gives us 5/7. Simple enough. Now let's take a different example. Let's say we had 3/7 and we wanted to add that to 2/5. Now, can we apply this property, the addition property of fractions? And the answer is no, we cannot. The property cannot be applied. Now, that doesn't mean you can't add 3/7 to 2/5, but you can't use the addition property of fractions. There are some steps you have to go through in order to use the addition property of fractions. And the reason you can't use it is because the form of this expression doesn't match the form of this expression, mainly because you have two different denominators, 7 and 5. And in the property, it states that you need the same denominator, represented by the variable c here. All right, so let's look at the subtraction property. The subtraction property states that if you have a fraction a over c minus the fraction b over c, then the difference between the two is just the difference between the numerators over the common denominator. So let's say we had our fraction 3/7 and we wanted to subtract 2/7. The difference is just the difference of the numerators, 3 minus 2, over the common denominator, 7. So that would be 1/7. Simple enough. Now let's take a look at the multiplication and division properties of fractions. The multiplication property states that if you have the fraction a over b times another fraction c over d, then the product is just the product of the numerators over the product of the denominators. So let's take the two fractions 3/7 times 2/5. Well, following the property, the product is just the product of the numerators, 3 times 2, over the product of the denominators, 7 times 5. And that gets us 6/35. Let's do another one. Let's say we had 5/6 times 2/3. Again, the product of the numerators gets us 10, and the product of the denominators gives us 18. And that is a correct answer, but you remember, you should always leave all of your fractions in simplest form. And since both 10 and 18 are divisible by 2, we could write this as 5/9. Because when dealing with fractions, you should always simplify. And finally, the division property of fractions. Now, the division property of fractions is really the multiplication property in disguise, because every division problem is a multiplication problem in disguise. So when you divide a fraction a over b by the fraction c over d, what you're really doing is you're multiplying that first fraction by the reciprocal. So multiplication by the reciprocal. Division is always just multiplication by the reciprocal. So let's take a concrete example. Let's say we had the fraction 1/2 and we wanted to divide that by 3/7. So we don't actually perform the division. We turn this division problem into a multiplication problem. That's going to be 1/2 times the reciprocal of 3/7, which is 7/3. And that gets us 7/6. And since that's an improper fraction, it would probably be best to convert that to a mixed number. 6 goes into 7 one time with a remainder of 1 out of 7 parts. And there we go. Our final answer is 1 and 1/7. And those are the four properties of fractions.